evening or good afternoon, depending where you are. My name is Remy Sofiso. My pronouns are he, him. I'm one of the co-chairs of Inter-Engineering. I'm based in the UK in Bristol. I'm a civil engineer and outside of Inter-Engineering and work for Atkins. And so we have recently decided to start this series of events on various topics, and this is the first one of all the events and types of resources that we're going to put out in the next sort of year or so. So this first event is on around the topic of LGBT plus rights and the law and these sort of things, just so that we can get a better understanding of what are rights now, but how actually have we gotten there in the past, because I know myself, I didn't know much until I actually started reading into it, and I feel like as a community we need to know these things, but we don't necessarily tend to actually do the research. But just before I give the microphone away to Will to give his presentation, I just want to make you aware of a few events that we have coming up in June. So we are redoing the Birmingham Pride festival, which we did last year, which was replacing essentially the prides that we would normally do physically when we're outside and partying, basically. So instead of doing that again, we've decided that we would put a series of events starting from the 1st of June. We have some very great speakers this year. We've got an event on diversity within our own community, which will be a panel discussion where we have the lovely comedian Rosie Jones, we have Sophie Ducker, Jonathan Mayer, Redmond, and I'm going to try and not butcher the name, Shrug El Attar. We also have on the 2nd of June a quiz night. The 3rd of June, we will have another talk on the experiences of gender and sexual minorities during the crisis, and more specifically the pandemic that we've just had. So we have two fantastic speakers for that. We've got Dr. Billy Howarth and Dr. Jack Lopez. They're both academics, so they'll give us some insights into their research and what they found out and how we've actually been impacted by this pandemic. And then finally, on the 4th of June, we will have a movie and social night, so have a look for this. We'll also share in the chat all the links where you can register for these events. We will also have on the 28th of October, if I remember correctly, a summit where we will gather people where you can apply to join us. And this will be based in Birmingham, and we'll try and basically have a look at what's next in our community. What do we do? What do we need to do next to improve our current sort of situation with equality, workplace rights, but also in terms of feeling better at work, being able to be yourself at work. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I had to say at the beginning. If you have any questions, do feel free to put them in the Q&A. This event is recorded, so I won't say your names at the end. I'll just ask the questions, and if it's something that's you don't want to be in the recordings, just mention it in the question as well, and we can easily crop it out, so it's not an issue at all. And I think that's pretty much it. So, Will, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Remy, and thank you for joining today. Apologies you can't see me. I've been having a few computer issues today, so I've not been able to get my camera working. Just imagine, a tall person with a full head of hair, looks good, perfect skin, nice teeth. That's me to a T. There may be a slight exaggeration there in certain parts. I am tall, though. But yes, I am the head of equality and diversity at the University of Wolverhampton, and I'm delighted just to talk to you today about LGBT equality and really the evolution of the law over the past 50 or so years. And we're going to begin We can get to the next slide. We're going to, as I said, we're going to look at the key milestones, so LGBT equality, the cultural and political context behind these issues, and the outstanding issues we face today. But first, a quick quiz question. When did male homosexuality become legal across the UK? Was it 1967, 1980, or 1982? So if people want to have a go at putting it in the chat, and we'll give it just a minute and see what answers people come up with. So we got someone said 1967, someone said 1982. I think people have rumbled me. Yes, the correct answer is indeed, I'm going to shut the chat. The correct answer is indeed 1982. 1967 is the year male homosexuality becomes legal in England and Wales after the Wolverhampton report. It's then extended in 1980 to Scotland, and then finally extended to Northern Ireland in 1982. Both the extensions to Scotland and Northern Ireland were in the face of basically the European Court of Justice threatening to take the UK government to court and to deliver verdicts against it. So it was with gritted teeth these extensions were made due to the idea at the time that Scotland and Northern Ireland were more socially conservative than England and Wales. I think we don't really think that now about Scotland. Arguably, we do still think that about Northern Ireland. Don't know if anybody saw in the news yesterday about Arlene Foster, the First Minister of Northern Ireland and the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, having to step down. And one of the reasons she's stepping down is that she abstained on a vote, a non-binding vote, about whether gay conversion therapy should be banned. And her party, some in her party were unhappy because that she thought she should have voted against the idea of banning that practice, which gives you an idea of some of the issues people are still facing in Northern Ireland. You may have noticed I talk about male homosexuality being made illegal, being made legal. Reason why we classify it as male homosexuality rather than just homosexuality is that the laws that had banned male homosexuality in the Victorian era, the Sexual Offences Act, only ever discussed banning sexual acts between men. The long-standing rumor, myth was that Queen Victoria refused to allow any bill banning homosexuality to mention the idea of female homosexuality because she could not envisage the idea of two women having sex with each other. I think modern day analysts believe it's actually because they couldn't work out a way to define female homosexuality acts, homosexual acts, and so they just went with male homosexuality because it was easier to place in law. Should be said that when we talk about that legalization, it wasn't as if things became accepted and normal and left alone by the authorities after the legalization of male homosexuality in England and Wales in 1967. Throughout the 70s and 80s, men were arrested under general laws against gross indecency. And you actually would have police posing as agent provocateurs, going into gay clubs, hanging around public restrooms, trying to tempt men to seduce men into homosexual acts, so they could then arrest those men as having been guilty of gross indecency. And this was such a notorious and common thing. Several police forces, including I think the Met, actually had to apologize in the 2010s for their behavior in the 70s and 80s. So even the legalization of male homosexuality did not stop oppressive state power being used against homosexuality. One of the interesting things to note about that legalization is it was very much seen not as saying that homosexuality is okay and that we want to make the world more inclusive. It was very much seen as a way of stopping blackmail. The 50s had been rocked with several scandals involving gay civil servants being turned by the Soviets due to the fear of prosecution. The Cambridge Four, the Purcell affair. And it was thought that actually legalizing male homosexuality would reduce the danger of gay civil servants, if exposed, then being kind of forced to turn against the government and help the Soviets. And if you want an example of the kind of contemporary attitudes and debate on homosexuality, the 1961 film Victim, which talks about a gay man being blackmailed by somebody and what that does to his life, probably gets the tone much more than maybe some of the more pro-gay rights, pro-gay equality tenure you might assume. It was a small step to gay equality, but it was very much just this has gone too far. We still don't approve of it in inverted commas. We just don't want it to be illegal anymore. Obviously, a key thing in the 80s was the AIDS pandemic. And I think it is, in a weird way, it is both something that added to the stigma that is attached to being gay, but it's also something that started to break down barriers. So obviously, as I'm sure most people here are aware, but AIDS begins in the late 70s, early 80s, where it comes to the West in the late 70s, early 80s. We're not entirely sure where it'd been beforehand, but there are beliefs it was in Western Africa as early as the 60s, and it was in the Caribbean in the mid 70s. But it comes to the West in San Francisco and in New York, and then it hits London, and then it spreads across the Western world, and then obviously further afield as well. To begin with, very much seen as predominantly a quote unquote gay issue, a gay disease. Some people have maybe seen Fauci in America during the various briefings on coronavirus. He basically had a similar role back in the 80s, and he would one of his ideas was literally to call it, I think, gay immunity deficiency syndrome. And it took a while for people to understand that what was causing it, why were gay men particularly likely to be victims of it, and how we could actually start to combat it through safe sex using things like condoms. Now, where it actually helps in terms of pushing forward the cause of gay equality or LGBT equality is first of all, you actually force people to talk about it. So the photo I've got here is of the famous adverts that the BBC played in the mid 80s as part of the NHS's public awareness campaign about AIDS and how to defeat the disease and how to stop transmission. And it was incredibly frank by the standards of the time, maybe even the standards of today, to be honest. Talking very openly about gay sex, talking very openly about the need to wear condoms if you're a gay or bisexual man having sex with another man, about the dangers posed by anal sex and frissions and all this sort of stuff. And it was extremely controversial in the government when this was being debated. Actually, the minister in charge, Norman Fowler, just today stood down as the Lord Speaker. Amazing how long these people's careers are when you think about it. But he was asked by Margaret Thatcher, do we have to mention gay sex? Can we not mention gay people? And he was like, no, it won't be effective if we don't mention gay people. They're the community that's being affected. Primarily affected. We actually have to speak about it. The other thing when it comes to the AIDS pandemic that really did change the contours of gay life, of the cause for LGBT equality, is it did place a bigger emphasis on the issue to do with marriage. Back in the 60s, back in the 70s, a lot of queer activists, of radical lesbian, gay, bisexual thinkers had argued that actually marriage wasn't important, that was part of the patriarchy, it was part of straight society, and that wasn't actually something that needed to be important. But as you had throughout the AIDS pandemic, gay men losing their boyfriends, losing their partners, being barred from making decisions about healthcare, being barred from attending funerals, even being kicked out of their own homes, because they didn't have the protection against their partner's parents that being married would give them, that started the move towards this idea that actually, no, gay marriage was really important, same-sex marriage was really important, and because of the protections it would offer. And it's not a coincidence that one of the people who most brought the idea to prominence, a British-American writer called Andrew Sullivan, was himself does himself have HIV, and so you definitely see that kind of emphasis on gay marriage. You can trace its roots back to the issues people are having after partners died in the AIDS pandemic. Also in the 80s, you have Section 28. This was an amendment to laws governing local government. It banned local authorities from promoting homosexuality, and there was a special emphasis on preventing schools teaching that homosexuality was acceptable in family life. This was an issue that bubbled up throughout the 80s. The quote-unquote loony left in local government, trying to promote diversity in lifestyles and family life, and the more conservative figures, both in the government and the media, saying that this wasn't acceptable. Only the traditional Christian nuclear family should be taught to children. There'd actually been a couple of attempts before Section 28 to get the law amended, and the Thatcher government eventually allowed an amendment to be made to it. No, even if what you think of the law, and obviously it's incredibly homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic, it was an incredibly badly written law. It was very unclear what it actually meant, and what it didn't mean, and what it did cover, and what it didn't cover. There was, as you can imagine, intense outpouring of anger from LGBT people. The photo there is from one of the bigger marches to protest against it. If you squint, you might see somebody at the front in a very nice white jacket. That is Ian McKellen, because Section 28 was what caused Ian McKellen to come out as gay, so he could lead the protests against it. It's also what led to the creation of Stonewall, which today is the UK's largest LGBT rights advocacy organisation in the country. And it did have a profound effect. I mean, there were stories of local authorities being unsure whether they could provide council housing to gay couples because of the law. I know I went to school in the 90s and noughties, and I came out to a teacher because I was looking for some support, and the teacher turned around to me and said, "I'm not sure what I can do due to Section 28. I'm not sure if I can even help you." So yeah, it was an incredibly big deal, and it had a severe impact of those of us who kind of interacted with local authorities or schools in the 90s. So, of course, that's kind of the past. And obviously, as you may have noticed, we don't live in that world anymore. And so it's a good question of asking why it changed. And the answer is it basically changed due to Tony Blair. Like, not to make too political a point, but actually the Labour government made huge strides when it came to LGBT equality, which we'll go through in a second. And it really was a watershed moment. And I think it basically, Britain having not been particularly advanced when it came to LGBT equality relative to America or to other European countries, we did become one of the leaders by the time that kind of new Labour period came to an end. First, we did have very early on in Tony Blair's government, we did have the Soho pub bombings, which is just something I want to factor in, because this is probably the most high-profile homophobic incident in British history. A guy basically planted nail bombs in several gay pubs across Soho, killed people, injured people. And actually, one of the really interesting things about it was that one of those first points when the police had to kind of support the LGBT community as it was grieving, as it was scared, as it was kind of rolling from this sort of attack. And the Metropolitan Police basically put their hands up afterwards and said, "We had no idea to do this. we weren't comfortable with it, we didn't do a great job, we need to completely overhaul our practices so we actually know, like, how do you comfort a gay widower or a lesbian widower? No, how is that different to when you're comforting a straight person who has lost their husband or wife? And so, actually, horrible situation. People died and were injured, but it did actually change things for the better in the long run by making key aspects of the state reconsider their relationship and their engagement with the LGBT community. But let's go on to what Tony Blair's government did. And so this is a whistle-stop tour through all the different changes they brought in. So first of all, in 1999, they changed the law so trans people were protected against this discrimination in the workplace. Hadn't been any protection against trans people, even though in the 60s the Race Relations Act was passed. In the 70s, the Sex Discrimination Act was passed. In the 90s, in the mid-90s, the Anti-Disability Discrimination Act had been passed. Only in 1999 were trans people protected. The age of consent was equalised in 2001. So obviously for sexual activity, there is an age of consent after which you are considered an adult and capable of entering into relationships with people, and that had been unequal. There was a higher age of consent for homosexual sex between male homosexual acts than there was for straight sex, and there was actually no age of consent for lesbians. And that was all equalised back in 2001 with the age of consent set at 16, regardless of whether you're a straight couple, a same-sex male couple, or a same-sex female couple. Section 28 is abolished in 2003. Now, you might be thinking, that's an awfully long time considering New Labour were elected in 1997. Like, how come this homophobic piece of legislation got to stay on the statute book for so long? And the reality is because the House of Lords kept complaining about it and they kept vetoing the change. And it actually took the Parliament, they actually had to use a Parliament Act when the House of Commons overrules the House of Lords to finally get Section 28 off the statute book. Also in 2003, we finally get protection against LGBT people against discrimination in the workplace. So again, as I was saying when I was talking about trans people, you think how early there were protections against sexist or racist discrimination in the workplace, and it took until 2003 to get those same protections for LGBT people. You also had in 2003, they were busy in 2003, a legal process was established to formally change your gender. Gender transition had been a thing medically since I think 60s, 70s, but you had this bizarre thing where actually people could have operations to reassign their gender so their gender was the same as that was inherent to them, rather than the one that had been assigned at birth. But there's actually no legal process to kind of make that clear and make sure that you are legally recognized as the correct gender. And this is the Gender Recognition Act, and it sets up the situation where you are assessed by medical practitioners. If they say you have completed your gender transition, you're given a gender recognition certificate, and this is an important one for anybody who ever has engaged with this in the workplace. You're never meant to ask for the gender recognition certificate. That's a private thing for the individual person. They don't have to show it. You're not meant to ask. What you actually get is more importantly than the GRC, is you get your birth certificate amended with your gender and with any changes to your name as well. And apparently it's quite a thing to see, because it is literally the same birth certificate that your parents would have filled in, just updated to have the correct gender. Then in 2005, we had same-sex civil partnerships. This was an interesting one. We'll talk about gay marriage in a bit, or same-sex marriage in a bit, but it was interesting because at the time, there was a real debate whether it should be same-sex civil partnerships or same-sex marriage. And this was the compromise at the time, where we'd have civil partnerships and leave the issues of marriage to another day. Same-sex couples also could legally adopt children in 2005 in England and Wales. Previously, if you were in a same-sex relationship and you wanted to adopt anybody, you had to do it as an individual. You couldn't do it as a couple, which created all sorts of odd issues in terms of, well, what happens if one partner dies? What happens if a couple breaks up? So couples could finally legally adopt. There was a delay in that coming into Scotland and Northern Ireland. It took until 2009 for that to happen in Scotland, and it took until 2013. It took until 2009 for that to happen in Scotland, and it took until 2013 for that to happen in Northern Ireland, and that only happened as a result of a court order. And unfortunately, the guy who resisted same-sex adoption is one of the front runners to become the new First Minister. So again, Northern Ireland politics not great when it comes to LGBT equality. So we then get same-sex marriage. That's introduced by the coalition government in 2014. Scotland follows suit in the same year. Same-sex marriages only came to Northern Ireland last year during that period when there was no devolved assembly, and so Westminster could pass laws on Northern Ireland's behalf, and the legislation to have same-sex marriage was extended to Northern Ireland. So, as I would say that we're looking at the big frontier when it comes to LGBT rights now in terms of legal rights. We are looking at issues related to trans rights that tend to be the most controversial. As I mentioned, the Gender Recognition Act of 2003 created a clear process for a trans person's true gender to be recognised. However, that act has fallen behind evolving understanding of non-binary gender identities and the diverse form gender transition can take. So, for example, the way the Gender Recognition Act envisages transition is it's very focused on, you begin with a social transition, then you begin a medical transition when you start taking hormones, and then finally you complete your transition when you start having surgical transition. And it's only when you've completed all three that you can have said to have completed transition. But that's not true of every trans person. It's certainly not true of non-binary people, many of which don't want the full gamut of surgical interventions. And there's no understanding or recognition of that in the Gender Recognition Act as it stands at the moment. There is also the ongoing debate about whether you actually need a panel of medical practitioners to verify whether somebody has completed their gender transition, or whether people should be able to self-ID, affirm their gender identity. Now, one of the things I would stress about that is the question of affirming gender identity gets very contentious when it comes to, well, what happens to the ability to have quote unquote female only spaces? Like, if you allow people to affirm their gender identity, would that mean you can no longer exclude non-cisgender women from certain things such as rape abuse centres, from sport, etc., etc., etc. And I think the key thing to understand is the Equality Act of 2010, which didn't exactly advance the cause of LGBT equality too much in of itself, although it did extend protections for LGBT people in terms of the provision of services more generally. The way the Equality Act of 2010 works is you can limit services, activities, jobs to a particular group of people if you have a legitimate reason. It's called the genuine occupational requirement. So for example, it's perfectly acceptable for the Catholic Church to say, you gotta be a Catholic to be a priest. That's allowed because that's a genuine occupational requirement. Likewise, if there's a real reason, based on evidence, based on need, that you have to restrict things to cisgender women, you can do that. That hasn't changed. Gender identity, sex are two separate protected characteristics. if you need, whatever happens with gender identity, if it becomes easier to affirm yourself as a trans person, that doesn't affect the gender protected characteristic of the Equality Act. It doesn't affect the ability of people to limit services to cisgender women if it's necessary. So it is a bit of a rabbit hole people have fallen down these past few years, because whatever the issues are with self ID, it won't actually affect the provisions of the Equality Act when it comes to protecting spaces that need to be limited to cisgender women, which in my experience, working equality and diversity, are pretty few and far between. And then this is just one final thing, and this is a bit of a plea on my behalf. This is me kind of shaking my fist at a cloud. There is no such thing as Pride Month in the UK, and this is something I just like to raise people's awareness of. You may have seen last year, particularly the year before, a lot of emphasis on July as Pride Month. It's something that happens in America. It's based on when the Stonewall riots happened, obviously, and America doesn't tend to celebrate LGBT History Month like we do in February, because that's when they have their Black History Month. And so Pride Month is very much their version of LGBT History Month, with a lot of emphasis on speakers and articles about LGBT history and culture. What we have in the UK is actual local LGBT prides as a very common thing all across the country. And they aren't just in June. Some happen in May, some happen in June, some happen in July, some happen in August, some even happen in October, and they're pretty cold. If you as an organization, if you as in the companies you work for want to support Pride, find out where your local Pride is and offer to support them. Give them some money, offer to run a stall, offer to promote it to your workers and customers. Don't just kind of go for the cookie cutter corporate, we'll send some treats out in June because June's Pride Month. Doesn't exist in the UK. It's not a thing. Support local prides. Don't just send a tweet. And that's it. That's what I had to say. And I'm more than happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you very much. Well, that was again because I had seen something similar before that you did, and it's great to see all that again. It's definitely very interesting to get all that information about what how it's been like, and especially for me, I'm not from the UK, so I don't even know what the history of France is like in terms of the rights. That's something that maybe I'll have to look into one day. Oh, we've got someone with a question, so we'll probably just go straight to do that. So we've got a question asking, is it not possible to make it a Pride Month?
I would say no, personally, because we have LGBT History Month in February. And the reality is that Britain is such a small country compared to America. The prides, I don't say they're in competition with each other, but they're kind of in competition with each other. So you would undermine the smaller prides if you said we're all going in 1 month and this is a month for Pride, because someone's not going to go to say I live in Wolverhampton. Someone's not going to go to Wolverhampton Pride if it's the same month as Birmingham or Brighton's. And so I think that's where I don't think Pride Month really works for us. So the stuff that you want to do as a big awareness raising month, we can do that in February for LGBT History Month. The stuff in terms of Pride events, we use the whole summer for them.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. There's a lot of small places. I know even near Bristol, there's all the kind of small town that are along the coast, and you get I think Weston-super-Mare and other prides that happen. And I've seen it before on the train when you get on the train and you pass through the station, and they've got all the flags everywhere. And if you had Bristol Pride at the same time, it just wouldn't help, no. Basically. But I don't think it stops people from doing what they want to do and when they want to do it. But as long as it doesn't undermine the kind of smaller communities like you've described, because it's trying to give a fair shot at it for everyone. Because it's quite an investment to organise these types of events.
It really is, yes.
Yeah. And I know John, the person who's on the background just doing the technical stuff. He used to be on organising these sort of things in the past, and it's intense. It can get quite intense in terms of the organising.
I was involved in one where we had a big grand budget, and we still lost money because they are so expensive to organise.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. If you have anything else to ask, don't hesitate to put it in the Q&A. If you want to share something, you don't have to put your name in there in terms of maybe you've got something to share or say. But in the meantime, there we go. We've got a poll going on.
Ooh.
Which is the best prize?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, we see how people vote. I've never been to London Pride. I should do that at some point. I've been to Birmingham Pride. So I think of those options, I would have to say Birmingham. I always really like Nottingham Pride because it was because it's in a nice park. It's got a good vibe. You feel quite secure. And I just really enjoyed Nottingham Pride. The first time I went to Leicester Pride, we actually had nuns praying for our souls, and not in a good way, but as in you're all going to hell, and we're gonna stand on this pavement as you all for your LGBT Pride march, and we're gonna pray for your souls. And that was a very odd thing to see as a 19-year-old.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. It looks like people are going mostly for London. I used to live in Manchester, so I can say that Manchester is really good as well.
I've never got round to going to Manchester Pride. I've been on the Manchester scene quite a few times, but for some reason the days have never worked out for me. I should really try and correct that at some point.
Well, if they do it this year, they might delay it to September or October, so it might work out.
Well, you know what? I think the idea for Birmingham Pride at the moment is to do it at the end of September. But I think a big issue with these, yes, it's confirmed that London has indeed won. But I think the big issue that all these big events are having is issues with insurance, and so there's quite a few music festivals that have had to cancel. They should be happening after restrictions have ended, just because they can't get insurance in case they have to be postponed due to COVID. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
We do have a question from Philippa. Oh, sorry, I'm not meant to say names, so I won't say names. There's a question about, does the European Union have any shared laws on LGBT rights? Yes and no. So the European Union has, through the European Convention of Human Rights, and then particularly the Charter of Fundamental Rights, basic principles about LGBT equality that are then that is then the responsibility of national governments to make sure their laws comply with. I think it would be fair to say there's great diversity across European countries about what is and isn't happening on the ground. If I remember correctly, at the very least, homosexuality has to be legal, and you have to have some form of civil partnership. You don't have to have gay marriage, but you have to have some form of legal way for people to form a union if they're a same-sex couple. But gay marriage is very spotty in Europe. I mean, I think even Germany only did it relatively recently. And there was a British overseas dependency whose name I'm forgetting, that actually is the first polity in the world to go back on gay marriage and repeal it. And they repealed it to go back to just having civil partnerships. So there is general principles. But it will vary in country to country. I know, obviously, like countries like Poland and Hungary have become increasingly hostile to gay rights as those countries have moved towards the right. Stonewall can be quite good for stuff like this in terms of in terms of they do country by country briefings. So if you look on Stonewall's website, you can often find useful information about how countries compare, and not just the legal situation, but also what is the status on the ground. So it's not a European example. I'll give you an example. I've been to Trinidad quite often. In Trinidad, technically, homosexuality is illegal, but there are gay bars. There are people who are openly gay. I wouldn't say people are happy about that, but it's not a big deal. Whereas Jamaica, it is a big deal. People are very unhappy about homosexuality, and you would be at risk if you're caught being open about being LGBT. And there's no such thing as open LGBT bars. But like on the ground, on the surface, both have the same legal framework. So it is that complicated thing of what's the law, but then what is the prevailing attitude in society as well.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I know even myself and my partner, we look at whenever we want to go on a holiday. Is the next thing we do is it okay to go there? Just to kind of check that, it's legally is one thing, but it's if you feel like you're going to go there and be looked at 100% all the time, it's not a nice holiday, especially the holidays we're going to do now, because it's every holiday we can have now, we're going to have to cherish it with COVID. There's another question, but it was put in the chat, but I'll read it out as well. Actually, maybe it was more of a comment. They do have LGBT History Month in the USA. It's the same month as Black History Month in the UK. Always found it confusing when working for an American company.
That's interesting. I mean, I did know there was something in October. My impression is it's not that big. It's not as big a thing as LGBT History Month is here, and it's very much the Pride Month that takes preeminence. Because for those that know, the Pride Month had it was like an edict from Clinton that proclaimed June as Pride Month in America. So that seems to be the one that gets more attention. But yes, no, that I should have mentioned that it does exist technically. The history of Black History Month in the UK being October is fascinating. Because it's apparently because they thought it would be useful for schools and universities. It's the worst month for schools and universities to have Black History Month. So I don't know how they got that idea.
Yeah, I don't know.
We all just came back from the summer holidays.
Yeah,
you're trying to get all this restart the new year, so it's very difficult to fit things in. So, it really should be June, July in this country for Black History Month. But never mind.
Yeah. There's another question. Hi. I don't know what that means, but I hope or maybe the government's. The government's LGBT advisory panel has recently disbanded. There is also quite a delay on the banning of conversion therapy. Is the UK at risk of regressing in terms of LGBT rights and equality?
I'm not sure. I don't think there's a danger of regression, with one exception I'll talk about in a second. I think there's definitely a loss of momentum. I don't think the current government is as interested in being seen as pro-LGBT rights as the previous two Conservative prime ministers were, which means that there isn't that forward momentum that it seemed that we had. I think, with the banning on conversion therapy, I think that will happen at some point. But these things do tend to take a while, as you could see with the list of things that New Labour had done. They actually come surprisingly late in their term of office. So I'm not too worried about that. The thing I would say is the disbanding of the advisory panel, I think, is of a piece where this government is less interested in using data to identify issues when it comes to equality and diversity. Theresa May was very into that. Commissioned the race disparities unit, commissioned the LGBT disparities analysis, proceeded with the move to have gender pay gap statistics published, was advocating for ethnicity pay gap statistics to be published. And that kind of emphasis, this government doesn't seem to be interested in at all. And I think that's a shame, because I think that's where we really are world leader. In Europe, there is less of an emphasis on collecting data and analyze data to see how different demographic groups do, which means you actually get a lot of hidden hidden discrimination going unreported, unnoticed. And so I think the fact that the government is trying to stop that data collection, that data analysis, may cause regression, as we're not doing the work of identifying hidden discrimination where it exists. The other thing is the issues with trans rights, and I think, you know, when you talk to Americans, there's definitely a sense that the UK has become like very transphobic, and it's like an epicenter of world transphobia. I think that is a slight misreading of what's happening in the UK. I think if you look at any opinion poll surveys, there doesn't seem to be any traction with transphobia in the public. There's no talk of any laws, of introducing any new transphobic laws. The question we are working through is how to move forward, is how to get those changes to the Gender Recognition Act, which should happen at some point, hopefully, although not as soon as we hoped when Theresa May was Prime Minister. But that's not quite what the worst case scenario that some people would portray, particularly if they're in America, because the stuff in America is horrifying. Because like in America, I think Florida just yesterday passed a bill banning all trans athletes from participating in school or college sports, which is complete overreaction and is just blatant transphobia.
Yeah, no, that's it's really it's really weird to see how all these different places just keep going, sometimes forward, sometimes backwards, and it's almost hard to keep up with it.
It's the what is it, I think Obama's line where, you know, the bend of history arcs towards progress, but then he kind of has a caveat where, you know, it takes a few zigzags along the way. Just going to double check this. So someone's just posted in their chat about a court appeal. So I'm just going to quickly remind myself of the case. I saw a question about what your job career is and what you studied to go into a similar field. So yes, as I said, I'm head of quality and diversity at the University of Wolverhampton. In terms of how I got into the job, I mean, it's a weird one, really. So I was very involved in LGBT activism when I was young. I was involved in an LGBT youth group, and we were doing like safe sex campaigns, political awareness, marches, stuff like that. When I went to university, I got very involved in my LGBT student association. I was a students' union executive officer that was responsible for minority representation. And I then got working in like a policy background within higher education. First working for a students' union as like an advisor to the student officers, and then working for a university, basically writing that the contract they have with the government for widening participation, which is basically measures to help with social mobility. And then I just happened to be able to apply for this job and get it. So, which is basically the way of saying is I've kind of fluked my way into this job, which I know is not very helpful. But I think the honest answer is one, it's commitment. It's showing that you have a CV, that you've done things involved in equality and diversity. Two, it's thinking about what is the thing within equality and diversity that you particularly want to have an emphasis on, because equality and diversity is quite a wide job. So there's events organisation, there's policy writing, there's HR casework, there's training, the service provision, and my gut is the easiest way to get in is to pick the things of equality and diversity that really appeal to you. Make sure that you're strong in those areas and build that up and then look for what jobs are available. if you're very into the casework side, then obviously, it is becoming like an accredited HR professional. It's probably a guaranteed way, because I know in a lot of organizations, their quality and diversity unit is quite an integral part of their HR department. And, it's HR professionals that have gone from HR to learn how to apply their HR knowledge to equality and diversity. So I hope that helps. I'm just going to quickly read this. Okay, so this, I highly doubt this will make any impact, to be honest. The basic case that's been put forward is this idea of trying to get gender critical feminism protected as a belief under the Equality Act and the religion and belief clause. The courts have been quite careful about what they allow into that belief category, because they do know it's a bit of a Pandora's box if they let it become too broad. The idea is to really apply to roles that have a significant impact on your life in terms of the way you live your life. It's not just something you really, really believe in. And so the common example, which I'm sure they're trying to jump on, is veganism. And the idea that veganism has been, in some circumstances, accepted as a belief that is protected under the Equality Act. But obviously, veganism affects the food that you will eat. And so it has a very direct impact on the way you live your life. Just saying that you don't recognize gender recognition, I don't think that's a substantial enough belief with a big enough impact on how people live their lives to be accorded with that protection. And the reality of it is, what they're trying to do is the idea of they can't be fired for being transphobic. The reality is we have very clear precedents that people can be fired if they believe in hate speech, if they don't treat people properly. And then that's been established in numerous instances when dealing with racists in key positions. So I can see what they're trying to do. I don't think it will work. Is my belief.
No, thank you. We've got one more question. I'm just going to ask, and maybe one more question after that. So if anyone's got a final question, maybe we'll take that one, and then one more, and then that way we can more or less wrap it up at 7 o'clock. So the question has just come up, is the Pink News headline for the UK today is UK Equality Watchdog thinks it should be legal for gender critics to misgender trans people. Do you have any comments on this?
That's what we were just talking about. I don't think it's I think it's a silly argument, personally.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, there's people that want to do these sort of things. I always wonder what goes through their heads first, but it's always interesting to see how far people will go to try and get their point kind of almost put into a law, and then it just messes up everyone's effort to try and reach that inclusion level that we are at now, and then just people just come in and undermine everything. So but thank you very much for your questions. It was very good, and thank you, Will, for that presentation. I've learned a lot again because I have watched one of your previous presentations before, so it was more of a rewatch. But yeah, we have one comment as well saying that it was quite informative and a great discussion. So thank you very much for essentially teaching us more about ourselves and about our rights in the UK. Everyone else, we are welcome to register for the future events that we have. So don't hesitate to contact us as well if you have any questions or further questions. We're happy to basically reply and see what we can do and help you with. Will, I don't know if you had any events coming up maybe that you want to advertise.
Not anything at the moment. I think we have some more events going live soon. But thank you again for having me. I've really enjoyed it. And I think the best place to check out anything else that we're doing is what you did, which is go onto our YouTube page, University of Wolverhampton, because at the moment, all our events are online. So all our equality and diversity events are being put up there. And so there's some really interesting discussions we've had this past year. So yes, no, thank you again. And I hope the rest of your events go well.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye, everybody.